was my hard question.
Oh, that was the hard question. Wow. I thought the analogy to the like terrorist bike group was the hard question. So thank
They
you.
weren't really terrorists. Spoiler alert.
But you did a good job branding it that way, Joe.
Yeah, it was like I
That's
got
the peril of being on the defensive.
That's the takeaway.
I pulled the Freedom of Information request from the city, and I got all the 700 pages of paperwork, and I read it all, and it was it's like, it sounded really juicy when you're reading it, and then you like look at what actually happened, and you're like, so like nobody did anything?
You're like, so it's loud music and a lot of people on bikes?
You know, and I think that's sort of the thing with publishers is like you can kind of paint anything to seem controversial or like make it seem like it's overstated in any which way, or, you know, like not a big deal, conversely.
Hi, I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 28 years.
I'm Elly Blue, the Vice President of Microcosm. We started this podcast to share what we've learned with newer publishers, so you can learn from our mistakes. Or maybe you just want to learn about the publishing industry.
This week, we bring special guest to the pod, Brooke Warner of She Writes Press. Brooke, who are you, and why are you important in publishing?
Oh, well, thank you for that leading question, Joe. I'm Brooke, and I run two publishing imprints, actually, She Writes Press and Spark Press. Why am I important in publishing? I think that I have a long history in publishing, not as long as you, but maybe second most, which is I started in 2000, and I was just 23 years old, and I come out of traditional publishing. So I spent 13 years in traditional publishing before starting She Writes Press. And so I write a lot about the industry. In addition to being a publisher, I'm an industry watcher. I'm currently have a Substack, but for a long time I wrote for Huffington Post's book section, and I've written for Publishers Weekly. So I do feel like I have a finger on the pulse of what's happening in book publishing. And I'm an advocate, you know, I'm an author advocate and a publisher advocate, and I take those roles very seriously. I was on the board of the IBPA, which is the Independent Book Publishers Association, for 6 long years because I did my full service, and then I became board chair. So yeah, I've been around a while.
Cool. Well, we asked you on, I mean, you know, there's a lot of things that we could talk about, but the thing that sparked this conversation was our episode with Jane Friedman about hybrid publishing, and kind of the theme of that episode was author beware. Like, there's a lot of sharks in the water. You know, there are reputable houses. She mentioned there were a few. And you wrote to us and you were like, I'd like to tell my part of the story as somebody who uses this business model. Can you kind of like give us a big picture first of like, what does hybrid publishing mean? It's one of those words that can mean a lot of things. And like, what do you do? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think the issue that I have with what does hybrid publishing mean, and it means a lot of different things, is that it's been co-opted. I don't actually think it means a lot of things. I think that it got popular, and then predatory business models started calling themselves hybrid because they felt that they could sell their services to authors under that label, when those of us who have been actively trying to codify hybrid publishing for years are struggling, of course, to educate authors about what it is that we actually do. And so as part of my efforts with the Independent Book Publishers Association, I had started an advocacy committee. In that advocacy committee, we actually did codify hybrid publishing, and there was 9 points, and now it's 11 points. I think what's challenging is that hybrid publishing has been around for a long time. And I'm not talking about vanity publishing. You know, vanity publishing really was just authors self-funding their publishing of their own books, which frankly, it is not that big of a deal now. You know, that's self-publishing. That's any kind of self-funded publishing, which I don't really take issue with. Obviously, I'm a self-funded author myself. But I think hybrid, when we started hybrid publishing, I started talking about it a lot. You know, and I think what happened was a lot of people jumped into that water around the same time for all kinds of different reasons. So now what I see is that you have legitimate hybrids who are doing really good work in the world and who are actively trying to educate authors, who vet manuscripts. A lot of them have distribution, a strong sales track, all of that stuff. And then you have aspiring hybrid publishers who are really wanting to do a good job, but they're not quite there yet. They're not bad, they're not predatory, but they're not great either. They have a lot of work to do. They might not have the best covers or the best design team. They might not have great editorial protocols. And they should be seen as, doing good work for their authors, but their standards really probably need some improvement. And then you have predatory publishers. Predatory, they shouldn't even be called publishers, I think. They should just be called predatory companies who are just selling services to sell services. They don't really care about their authors. And so I think that's where we get into why is this middle space so messed up? And I will be the first to acknowledge it's messed up, but I do speak for the legitimate hybrids, and I want to welcome the aspiring hybrids to get there.
Yeah. And I mean, and to be fair, it's like any publisher can have a predatory agreement. I mean, I've reviewed agreements from very large publishers, and I was very surprised at how predatory of an agreement I've seen from a traditional publisher, which was in no way traditional, So it's you see that kind of any which way. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that when I was on your podcast, thank you for that, however many years ago, you called me young, and now you're acknowledging my seniority, which I love. This.
I'm very young.
Right, a couple years goes by. But so why did you choose this to be your business model?
Well, interestingly, when I started in book publishing in 2000, the first job that I got was at North Atlantic Books in Berkeley, and North Atlantic Books had a hybrid track. And so the way that North Atlantic worked is they did traditional contracts, but they also did hybrid contracts. And the hybrid contracts were reserved for authors who felt that they could sell a lot of books. And so it was actually the most entrepreneurial authors who were choosing the hybrid track because they were getting a much higher royalty. And there were all kinds of deals. I mean, sometimes North Atlantic bought the inventory, sometimes they didn't. They were very creative. I mean, we're way less creative in our contract than North Atlantic was, but that was my first job in publishing. And so it was actually all I knew. And when I got to Seal, I was like, oh, so where's the hybrid contract? And they were like, that's not a thing. And so it was eye-opening to me to come from this relatively creative space that Richard Grosinger, the publisher, had established, because he thought broadly about this industry. And I thought it was not only entrepreneurial, but very smart, and probably is what allowed North Atlantic to thrive during hard times and sold lots and lots of very niche books. And so when I started She Writes Press, I always had that hybrid model in mind. And I saw it as a way for authors to be able to get into the publishing space in a meaningful way. And I'm not a deep-pocketed millionaire. I couldn't have started my own publishing company. I had no backlist. And so in some ways, it was really my only option. That said, we didn't have distribution when we first started, and so I wasn't trying to be hybrid. I will say that it kind of morphed, within the first couple of years. At first, I wasn't calling us anything, and then people started saying, well, you're something. And I was like, well, that's true, but we're not traditional and we're not self, so we're something in the middle. And we did land on hybrid, and then I would say that myself and others have worked to codify that.
So can you briefly summarize that codification? What is the difference between this ideal model of hybrid publishing that's not predatory and, say, the ideal model of traditional publishing that's not predatory?
Yeah, well, I guess the points for hybrid are that the manuscripts do need to be vetted. It's not about just accepting anything, which is what service providers do. It's very important that the royalties be commensurate with the investment, right? And so what you have is it has to be over 50% at least. In our model, it's 60% print and 70% of ebooks that go to the authors. Distribution, this has been a really sticking point for hybrid codification because you guys do your own distribution, and when we have said, well, we want to have traditional distribution, there's been a lot of pushback on that because some people are saying, well, no, we're doing our own distribution. So we landed on active distribution, but as you all know, that could be a different show. The problems with distribution run deep. So it's active distribution. And a lot of other things on the list that kind of go into deeper territory, that we allow the authors to exercise their rights, but we will exercise their rights on their behalf, right? So that if we hold the rights, we're not doing nothing with them. We're actually trying to sell them on behalf of the authors. So this codification is really about giving transparency to authors about what their expectations should be for hybrids. So I think the main thing that I would like to differentiate between is the difference between hybrid publishing and service providers, right? Because service providers, you're just paying them for a service, whereas a hybrid publisher is your publisher of record, and they need to be doing things for you. Filing your copyright, publishing under their ISBN, holding high editorial standards, design standards, all of these things. And so that's a publishing company. I don't actually expect all of that of a service provider, first of all. And then Joe, you and I had an exchange, right? Like, we don't let the authors just be like, here's my cover art. Isn't it great? No, it's actually, 70% of the time awful, 20% of the time okay, and 10% of the time like maybe we could look at it. And so, we have our own high standards for the sake of the reputation of our own press. That's very, very important. And then in terms of where we're different from traditional, in many ways, I think we're closer to traditional, of course, than we are to self, just because of how we operate. But of course, we never, ever, ever will be traditional because of our financial flow, right? It's an author invested business model, hard stop. So we're not trying to be traditional, but we are trying to level the playing field for authors.
Cool. Okay. So like looking at that pragmatically, we receive manuscripts, you receive manuscripts, presumably.
Right.
We do a certain amount of headhunting, you probably do a certain amount of headhunting. But, like we like you and us would probably never be in competition for the same book. Like it maybe would happen once in a while, but so how does that acquisition process and conversation go?
Well, we do open acquisitions, of course. We might get an occasional agented manuscript. It does happen when an author brings their agent along, right? And so we accept our submissions. We have a pretty big submission pool, and we actually do a 2-tiered submissions process whereby the first round is read by outside trusted editors that I have worked with over the years to sort of vet yes or no. It's pretty easy, and it helps us to whittle down the amount of submissions that our internal team is actually looking at. So it's sort of like slush pile, and then someone says, okay, let's get rid of all of the stuff that is not going to be considered, and then come through to round 2, and then my publishing team, my group of project managers and myself and my associate publisher review what gets accepted, and then we put it on 3 tracks. It's either another rejection, middle ground is we think it's good in concept, but it's got some work to do. It probably needs development. Let's talk about what is happening here. And then the acceptance track is we're ready to offer you a contract. So I feel really confident in our submissions process. We are selective. And that said, I would never say that we're as selective as traditional publishers that are paying authors to publish. But the difference is that we are not claiming or hoping to judge authors based on their author platforms. And the reason, I would say the primary reason that authors get rejected from traditional publishing is not because of their books, but because of their lack of author branding or their social media followings. And so what we offer is, look, we're just going to look at the book. You don't have to have an author brand. You don't have to even have a website. And what that allows is for a lot of authors to springboard themselves into a space to build an author platform, right? To become an author and if their ultimate goal is traditional publishing down the road, they can springboard into that. And I wouldn't say we've had a ton of authors take that route, but we have had authors go on to traditionally publish after us, and we are fine with that, and if that's their happiness and that's their goal, great. We also have a lot of returning authors, and we also have a lot of authors who their next books they self-publish.
For what it's worth, we also don't require any kind of author platform, because honestly, I mean, unless the author's platform is huge, it doesn't really make a difference. And even if the author's platform is huge, look at Billie Eilish's book. It bombed.
Right. Yeah.
And she got all the social media followers in the universe.
Well, and that's the short-sightedness, I think, of traditional publishing a lot of times. And it's not always the case that someone has to have a platform, because fiction is kind of a unique beast, but publishing is very ageist. Publishing has a lot of sort of soft qualifications that it won't name to the authors. And it's not always, and I would say, you could even say it's rarely totally about the book. It's about a lot of other factors. And I think authors have a lot of blindness to that. And we do offer a path, I think, that is very hopeful and that allows authors to, get meaningfully reviewed, distributed, and sold.
So for us, like, the ideal relationship between publisher and author is a partnership. Like, we are each bringing our expertise to the table towards the same goal of getting the book in front of the readers, changing the reader's life. And the mechanism for doing that is selling books, not having them sit in our warehouse with brilliant contents and unpurchased copies. And one of the things, I've been talking with a lot of publishers of different stripes, doing working lit market research, and I met a ton of hybrid publishers for the first time at IBPA and just talked to a bunch of people. And it does seem to me that kind of like the danger of the well-meaning hybrid publisher is to start to see the author as the customer rather than see the reader as the customer, and to have to focus more on selling contracts than on selling books, because that's more of a guaranteed income stream. Right. And I'm wondering, how do you advise hybrid publishers to avoid that? Because that does seem like a bad thing. That does seem like a way that a well-meaning publisher can take advantage of an author.
Right. So what I think is that a lot of us, I actually think you've identified something really quite important in this aspiring hybrid publisher space, because many of us who are in the hybrid space, we come out of traditional publishing. And I think it's an asset because you understand the relationship between the publisher and the author in a very different way than if you come from being an author or if you come from being in another industry. And so the benefit of being a publisher that comes from the traditional world is that I am very strict with my authors, and I know other hybrid publishers who are as well. We're saying it's our reputation on the line. The benefit of having a traditional distributor, I will say, is that we answer to our distributor and our sales force. We don't answer to our authors. And so I have a lot of leverage to be able to say to my authors, this is not working and this is why. We're actually trying to sell your book. And so I think it's about having boundaries, but it's also really about owning your expertise in this space and being able to say no to authors. And I have seen that myself. I've seen publishers, hybrid publishers who are not comfortable doing that. And I set expectations very, very early on. I mean, the amount of author training and getting ahead of that question that we do is quite extreme for this very sake of, especially around covers, because I'll say, I'm probably going to push back on you guys, and this could be a tense conversation, but it is extremely important. And there probably needs to be some training for aspiring hybrid publishers on how to do better author management. But I will say I feel lucky because I came into the role, 13 years into author management at a traditional house, and I just carried that through. But I don't think that's true for everyone.
And I remember seeing hybrid enter more the ecosphere after the layoffs of 2008, that's kind of where I would pinpoint it, where there was a distinguishment. And I want to say that was about the first time I had heard that terminology.
Yeah, it's interesting though, Joe, because we started in 2012, and I don't know, there could have been some rumblings of that. Certainly Greenleaf was around earlier than that and doing stuff. And I think hybrid author was a term that you were hearing kicked around a lot too, which just simply meant like authors who were self-publishing and, traditionally publishing. So the term itself is probably a problematic term, but for those of us who have worked this hard and come this far, it's been a hard conversation to say like, oh, now we're going to pivot because this term, is tainted, perhaps you could pivot and call it something else, and then that term is going to become a problem. So that's something that, I feel a little saddled with or burdened by, I guess.
So in Portland, where Elly and I live, we have a very similar issue where we had this like monthly bike ride, and the police sent like spy informants to infiltrate it because
similar issue, very familiar to you, right?
You'll see the parallels like within a few hours, and they like literally were convinced that these people were terrorists. And then they just needed to prove it, and then they had them instigate it worse and worse and worse. And and it's just like people going on a bike ride, And this is like at the time of like the Bush administration that like all this took off, and it was like when we were called Little Beirut by the like famous visit and all this. And so over time, they cracked down they sent military vehicles to like bust up this bike ride. And then over time, people are just like, oh, if we don't use that terminology, if we like give it a new name, the police don't even come. And it's literally the exact same thing. And, and there were people that were like, no, this is our bike ride. It's our name. We are not budging. And then there were other people that were like, isn't it pleasant to not have to deal with like the associations? And because it was like by that point, like the paper had been reporting on like bike ride attacks, passersby, and things like that. And it was just like, it was baggage, definitely not more extreme than what we're talking about here. But, and I guess that's sort of the thing where like in the end, they had, and I don't remember, like the funnier part is they had a much more extreme thing that they do now called like, I think it's like the Thursday night, or it's like the Loud and Lit, and they like are way more disruptive and way more left alone. And, as a middle-aged person, I'm not like, I see the argument in both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's I guess I do too. And I don't know if it's because we're middle-aged or maybe just more compromising. I've always had a fairly compromising personality, actually. I'm a person who's like, oh, this is interesting and this is interesting. And oh, maybe you're right. Like I look at a lot of sides of things. And so for me, hybrid has been this middle way, and I've positioned it as an opportunity for authors who are shut out of the traditional world for whatever reason. So if I'm not so wed to the term, the problem is that I did help to create this hybrid criteria, and if we're like, never mind, we're calling it the co-publishing criteria or whatever, it doesn't actually matter that much, but the outside world wants to put a lot of labels on things, right? So you kind of have to call yourself something, and you want to call yourself something that people can wrap their minds around. But I do think it's co-publishing or partnership publishing or hybrid publishing, like they are sort of all the same. I am disappointed that hybrid has gotten such a bad reputation. That is really frustrating to me, because those of us who are doing it right have done an exemplary job. And Jane said in your interview, there's not very many of us. And all of these people who are trying to enter into the space, and I think, Elly, you used the right term, well-meaning. I don't exactly know what to do with that crew. I think they are well-meaning and they are doing, I'm sure they're helping their authors in some ways, but this publishing space that we're in right now really is the Wild West. It truly is. People are doing all kinds of things, which is something that I kind of love about it. But it's a double-edged sword. It also makes it very challenging.
Right. So what about, like co-publishing actually makes a lot of sense, because it does distinguish it. And, and I feel like what could be done fairly, well, not easily, but like rudimentarily, is to have like criterion where you're saying like, you are not a co-publisher until you meet these criteria.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's just who are the places that can codify or enforce that? You know, it might just be the IBPA. Maybe it's Pub West. You know, I mean, we're like a self-policing industry that doesn't really like to police other people, right? And so it's like the regulations are complicated. People, you know, even with the hybrid criteria, which granted is just through the IBPA, you go to PubU and everyone's like, oh, I meet the hybrid criteria except for points 3, 4, and 5, you know, and you're like, And so it's complicated, right? Like, I am not interested in like excommunicating those people, but it's a hard conversation, you know? And so that's why I say I think there are aspiring hybrids, and I actually want to welcome them into the tent and say, okay, how can you get there, right? How can you get all the way so that you can say, I meet all of the criteria? But at the end of the day, you know, short of having literally a list, which I think, you know, provides its own set of problems, we at the IBPA, I'll put myself in the we category as a former board member, you know, just continue to struggle with this.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like the thing that strikes me is that there's like endless demand from authors to be published. Endless. Like I have old friends from 30 years ago emailing me being like, hey, I found this place that will publish my book for only $20,000, you know, and it's like, what do I do? And, you know, I don't have a lot of great answers for them other than don't do that. But like, yeah, I guess so it seems to me the question is more like, how can that demand be shaped into something that's like kind of healthier for everybody, into something that like fulfills the goal of getting the right books to the right readers. Yeah, I don't know. It's a rhetorical question, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's hard because authors don't, you know, they're not always the best ones to decide which is the publishing path for them. You know, I mean, there are probably plenty of authors who publish with us who would be equally well served by self-publishing, but they don't want to and they don't know how, and they're not interested in that publishing path, right? And so I'll say to people, you know, if you're not planning to do any kind of marketing and publicity, this path is really carved out for people who want to do marketing and publicity and want to take things into their own hands. And so the proactive authors do really well, and the authors that are not proactive do as well as they would if they had self-published, right? And I'm very transparent about all of those things, but I think where, you know, the critique of hybrid gets complicated is that it doesn't take into account author expectations, and that when the author expectations aren't met, that they're disappointed. You know, it doesn't take into account that the people who are very savvy and really understand how to utilize what this is do tremendously better than self-published authors. And so it's every author has their own experience, you know, and just as I always say, like, some people get a traditional deal and get $100,000 and they're still pissed off at their traditional publisher because of whatever reasons. Some people have awesome experiences self-publishing, right? Like, you can't like put your finger on a business model and say, oh, this business model is, you know, the root of all author disappointment and frustration, because it just is not that way.
So can you, and feel free to like not answer this question, but I'm curious about sort of like, in terms of numbers, your like best case, worst case, and like most likely scenario in terms of like outcomes for like the books breaking even, the author making money, the book selling well. Like, what are your
well, I mean, I don't have the metrics out in front of me, but interestingly, this does kind of circle into something you guys would be interested in, perhaps, is that most of our books are fiction and memoirs, right? Our best-selling book of all times is an Enneagram book, right? Because nonfiction, it's easier to sell. There is a known audience for that book. It is, you know, the Enneagram is insanely popular. I think this book has sold 40,000 print units, something like that, which is for us very good. The average memoir and fiction that we publish probably sells, you know, 1,500 to 2,000 copies is probably the average decent kind of memoir or fiction from someone completely unknown. The worst case scenario, 200, Definitely sometimes that happens. The author is just like, here you go. And then they abdicate all responsibility and have zero involvement, have no marketing plan, and even against my advice, right? And so that's quite a range. And then we have a lot of fiction and memoir that has done, our breakout has done, 5,000 to 6,000 copies kind of. So I'm actually quite open about the numbers and interested to talk about them, because one of the things that was a criticism, on the previous show was about memoir and fiction, which is what we do. And it's not an easy genre. Those two genres are not easy to sell, and these are debut authors, right? And so the reason that they're also having a hard time penetrating the traditional market is because they're not known, or they are trying to get their work out into the world. And so I do stand behind our model as being able to get them greater access and also traditionally reviewed. It's also a very hard case to make that this would be your next lucrative career. I think that is a hard one, and some authors come in with that mentality, and some are just like, this is my awesome novel that I've always wanted to publish, and I want to give it its best chance, and I'm really proud of it. And it does well by selling, 2,000 or 3,000 books, and it's gotten really well reviewed, and they're quite happy.
Yeah. And thank you so much for that transparency. I feel like that's the thing that a lot of people are not even in hybrid, but like in general. Like, I think like we've had a number of books that sold, tens of thousands to millions, but I think it's really hard for people to understand that like even selling 2,000 of a book is difficult in 2024,
Absolutely.
And so they feel like maybe they're a failure because they're selling 1,500, or, if they're doing poetry, 500, or,
I would
and
love to sell 500 copies of a poetry book. That would be incredible.
right. But but it's like, if that's your whole thing, yeah, it's like you have to just do so much more. So where we, and we run into the same sort of conundrums that you do, or for us they're not conundrums, but like working the author through it is more the conundrum, where they come in and like, I say that like an artist is the worst cover designer because they are approaching it wrong. They're approaching it to make something beautiful, but it's too interpretably beautiful, or it's just not, or they are really attached to something that just doesn't translate. And so, I would say also that like actually every single one of our bestsellers was a debut, and like, which, and we look at it from the merit of the book, or we look at it from, and by merit I mean like interest, marketability, like, like not just like, is it well written? We look at it from the like, is it cool? Would it help people? Like, would it save lives? And then if it does, then we're like, okay, that's a cool. And then a lot of, for years, our best-selling author like did not have a computer, so like, she literally had no platform, like she mailed us her everything, which is like
nice.
Incredible. And and this is not like 20 years ago. This is more recently. And so I guess that's the thing. It's like having those conversations, and I guess that's, maybe that's an advantage of like being distributed by Simon and Schuster versus like, in our case, sometimes it's literally like, since we are our own to market solution, people are kind of like, you don't like, how will you get it to its audience, or when we come back and we're like, this is what doesn't work for these reasons, like we don't really have that to leverage against. We have
but
to
you have your reputation and your longevity. I think that's the other thing, is like the more years in this business you are, the more years that your publisher has been around, your publishing company, I think you can lean on the accolades, and say, look, we do know what we're doing. We've been able to sell this book. And I do that all the time, right? I say like, we know this genre, but you're right. I do use our distributor a lot. I'll say, actually, we have to present this to our distributor and your idea is not working. But yeah, and I think second to artists being the worst cover designers are definitely memoirists, because memoirists are very, very attached to a vision in their head of, you know, themselves on the cover or something personal that they want. And sometimes that's perfect. But other times we're like, that's not going to sell the book. And those are often the hardest conversations because it's such a personal thing. But we also say to our authors, you know, this book is not a scrapbook, right? Like, you didn't come here to just make something for your friends and family. Ostensibly, you came because you want a broader audience. And I do think if you have these conversations with authors, they're like, oh, you're right. You know, so I think we have to encourage these aspiring hybrids to be more courageous.
Are you finding that reviews still move the needle significantly on sales?
I think the answer is yes, but that's because of it's a complicated relationship, as you guys know. You know, I mean, I think if you get really good reviews and you do advertising, then that moves the needle, right? Because we have a lot of success getting our books into libraries. And so that's where book list and library journal really matter. I really do think Kirkus is sort of more for bragging rights these days. And so I think they're just different. You know, they're different. We have a very strong relationship with Forward, and I think that matters in the indie space. And so I actually think they do different things.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So how do you judge the success of each book?
Oh gosh. I mean, that's a great question, because I think you do judge the success of a book on sales, right? I mean, we do, the authors do, but it's not the only measure of success. If the author is really proud of their book, if it's been well reviewed, if it gets decent distribution, you know, so we'll look at sales and say, look, the sales aren't that great, but it got picked up in ones and twos across so many different markets. And that's actually something to be really proud of. And to your point, like, look at a list of ones and twos and then count that up to 1,000 or 2,000. It is a shit ton of lines, right? And authors just have no concept of that, because when you're thinking about books going out into the marketplace in ones and twos, which they are, then 500 books, 1,000 books, it's a lot, right? And so I do, when authors feel disappointed, I do pull up their sales and I'm like, let's look at your actual lines. And like, they went to this individual bookstores, it got across, you know, 3 separate wholesalers, it got picked up by libraries. And so even if the numbers are not stellar, I do think that's a measure of the success, and also just the author's pride in having published the best story or book that they could have published, and that they feel like when they go out into the world and talk about it and get invited to sit on panels or speak or whatever it is, that they're seen in the world as an author. And I absolutely think it's more than sales, but it's hard not to just say, oh, we're only gonna pinpoint it to that.
Like, yeah, and I think you're right. Like, longevity is a good thing to hinge on. And, you know, and it's interesting too, because we do try to use that linchpin where we're like,
We know what we're talking about.
We're coming in on 30 years. Like,
right.
If we weren't doing okay at it, we wouldn't have made it this far. Like, there's not a lot of money in this business. Right. And still, you know, you get a lot of like, but my friend said or thinks, or I showed it to my mom, you know, that's a common one. And so like, how, you know, and I guess that's the thing. It's like, in your case, how do you mitigate that one? Like, how do you manage that conversation?
Yeah, hard conversations. You know, I mean, I think covers are where we push back the absolute most. Authors ask me, is it okay if I post this on Facebook? Is it okay if I poll my friends? I say, please don't do that. We tend to find it being a terrible idea. It's not helpful. Too many cooks in the kitchen. You know, I try to also get authors to trust their gut, you know, not overthink things. I think that's another thing. Authors will stare at their cover until they obliterate it, right? And then, whereas that's not the reading experience. And so I do try to train people about how readers look at books. I'll sometimes walk them through things if they get into a crisis around it. So I try to meet them with education and compassion, right? To say, look, this is really important and it means something to us, and we're actually trying to sell your book. And it doesn't mean that sometimes people don't veto their covers. I mean, that does happen and we have to start over. And I don't love it, but that happened when I was at Seal Press too, right? So we're not going to like force something that someone absolutely hates. But I also will say to them often, like, if you hate the cover, there was probably a problem with your cover memo. So let's go back to the memo and see where did things go wrong. I think you have to give authors the benefit of the doubt too, right? That they want to partner with smart people who have the best interest of the book project as well. And I think this idea that we're catering to authors' egos or just trying to make them feel good or treating them like the client, I don't. I just don't. I see them as, you came to me because you want to have the best book that you can have. And so we're servicing the book really. And I do want to have good relationships with the authors, but I do that through, keeping them on my level and saying, look, this is what I know about the industry. Let me share what I know. But to your point, Joe, yeah, we've also been in this for a long time. I've been in this for a long time. And so there's a reason that things are done the way they're done.
Yeah, I designed a cover this week. It's a book about bugs and how insects like secretly run the world, and it's real. And I picked my favorite illustration from the book to put on the cover, and I like designed it out. And then I sent it to our bug expert on staff, and I was like, did I screw anything up? And he came back and he's like, no, that's, like the coloration is a little bit like you took some liberties, but. And then the next day I'm looking at it and I'm like, I think those two bugs are having sex. and I sent it to Elly and I was like, is this what I think it is? And she's like, yeah, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
That's why they're ruling the world.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, there's like levels of meaning that are just like added by that. And it's like, you wouldn't notice it maybe immediately, but because it kind of looks like. And there's lots of photos where like there's bugs fighting or like one bug carrying another bug. But, I think about that and I like think about how most of the most effective covers that I've done in 30 years are like, they were like a happy accident in that way. And, and we find it a lot where we'll send something to the author. And they'll say, oh, okay, well, you could like change this and change this. And, you're like, well, yeah, but that doesn't actually like help anything. Like, yes, you can change it all day long if you wanted to. But so, yeah. And I guess that's, I don't know. Yeah. And we have an absolute authority, but like we take their feedback, like, whereas, and so they have to make a very good argument essentially. But,
absolutely. Cover design is hard, people. If authors are listening to this, it's challenging. I think there's animosity sometimes too, right? Where authors are like, oh, my publisher thinks they know everything and blah, blah, blah. Like I've gotten into this because I am on a podcast with someone who's primarily an author, right? Like in my co-hosting situation with Grant. And so every time the cover conversation comes up, he's coming at it from the perspective of the author and I'm coming at it from the perspective of the publisher. And I'm like, well, sometimes you have to shut that stuff down. Like it is true. Like if every publisher just let their authors do whatever they wanted, it would just be a complete disaster. And there's genre appropriate things, but then you get into questions of stereotypes and I don't want this because it's been done 1,000 times. So it's not an easy conversation. And I think it does really take discernment, because it takes discernment to say, we believe in this and it's important, but it also takes discernment to listen to the authors, and say, okay, that's actually a decent point. Right? Or yes, you can have some font variations, and not be so rigid about it that you're just like, no to everything. And we certainly don't do that either. So I look at this as like the most challenging part of the job, probably just around like cover decision making. And I'm not a designer, but I'm the liaison, between the cover team and the authors. And it's the place where there's the most tension, right? But at the end of the day, I feel like it's worth it, right? It's worth it to have those hard conversations for the covers that you end up with.
I would love to compare notes at some point about how you and we do author expectation setting and education, because that's a huge part of what we have to do as well.
Yeah.
Like our authors don't have the veto power and they don't have quite as much say, but they're still really invested. They are putting in, hundreds of hours of work into these projects, even if they're not putting in like cash. It's still a very emotional investment. It's they're bringing whatever they're bringing to it. So yeah, I feel like that we could do a whole other episode on that.
And honoring authors is a big deal, right? Like, I think that one of the reasons people like to go with non-traditional publishing is because we really do honor authors in a different way. And I'll speak more to the big five, right? I think what happens at the big five is that a lot of times authors are seen as sort of like a necessary evil, like, oh my God, well, we have to deal with them, but blah, blah, blah. That was the vibe at Seal a lot of times. I mean, we were good, but we, the more corporate we got, it was a little bit like, oh, well, like, don't let them know that we're doing this, that, or the other. The lack of transparency was profound, right? And so I think what authors like about indies, like you guys, or like the true indies, and then the other sort of indie space, which I would say is like whether you're hybrid or whatever, is that, is just someone taking them seriously and saying, yes, this is your project. You're the creator. You do, in fact, know something about your own project. And we are the experts in the industry that is going to sell the product. And so that's where the part comes in. But I absolutely, take my authors seriously, honor them, educate them. And then when I am like, no, you're wrong, I explain why.
Right. Well, the good news is the author in this case is like even more eccentric than we are. So she loved it. She thought it was great.
She liked the bugs having sex. I mean, she drew it, right? Or she had an illustrator.
She did. She drew it. Yeah.
So she must have liked it.
I would say she's as mainstream as we are.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. We'll have to edit that. And then I saw like there was an Amy Stewart interview where she talked about how she had an argument with her publisher about on the cover of Wicked Plants, and then and her publisher is sadly since deceased, but she was like, he was right, like he knew what he was, she like thought he was wrong at the time, and I was like, okay, it's like I need these stories sometimes because
you're only gonna tell them after you're dead. There's gonna be so many people saying Joe was right.
And it's not that so much as the like in the moment where you're like, because like the proof of that happened decades ago,
right?
But yeah, so well, I'm glad we got to return the favor of bringing you back on our podcast and return to you having me on yours.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it truly, you guys. I appreciate the conversations that we've had, and just thanks for your openness to, hearing everything. And that's the thing about this industry. We're ever evolving, but I think that I want to look at the people, who are doing good work, and also the people who have good intentions, and kind of be like, okay, how are we doing better for authors at the end of the day? And also, keeping the standards up for publishing. I certainly care about that, but at the end of the day, like, that's the work of a lot of people. So we'll keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub,
on Twitter at microcosm,
on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing,
on Instagram at microcosm_pub,
and here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.
Oh, our website, shewritespress.com, is the best place. If people want to reach out to me directly or check me out, I also have my own website, of course, brookewarner.com. But I'm widely out there and writing weekly on Substack too.